My final guest of the hour is Congressman Jake Auchincloss. Auchincloss is the newly elected representative from Massachusetts' 4th District. He's also vice chair of the Financial Services Committee and a member of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. He's obsessed with infrastructure. Congressman Auchincloss, it's great to see you. I've been a fan. In fact, I should just tell the audience, I have to deal with your father now and then, because he's a great hero in this country, working with Tony Fauci on infectious disease in this issue. But now you've got another area. So welcome to Washington proper and the policy community. But I'm interested. We're going to talk today a little bit about the president's infrastructure plan as you see it in Congress and where that intersects with ESG, sustainability, what we need to do on climate. What do you think the most important equities are that we have to get right? And is the infrastructure bill getting us there? You're muted, you're muted, Congressman, somehow. Hopefully it's not us muting you. There you go.
Thanks for having me on, Steve. It's good to be with you. And the answer to your question is yes, it directly addresses ESG. It's the most environmentally progressive infrastructure bill Congress has ever passed. And there's a number of reasons why, but the one I want to focus on is transportation infrastructure. In my home state of Massachusetts, 40% of our carbon footprint is attributable to the transportation sector. So if you're talking about a Green New Deal and you're not talking about transportation or vice versa, then you're missing something. And this bill intertwines the two. We are making bold investments into transit to reduce the number of single occupancy vehicles on the roads. We're making investments in walkability and cycling infrastructure so that people can get around in a zero carbon footprint way, which, by the way, is also better for economic development and public health. So this bill is incredibly bold and forward looking on environmental issues.
What do as we think of models, and I often think about things that we need to replicate. So you just talked about walkability. You talked about, believe me, Republicans and Democrats all have to deal with the pollution and the impact of fossil fuels. So what are the best models that we can look at that lift this discussion up that you think are replicable in the country? Is it Massachusetts? Are there other things that have informed the way you think about the synergy on transportation and climate?
So I think it's one, a mindset, and then two, there is a model. So the mindset is moving away from an orientation of car throughput, which for the last 70 years has really been how the federal government defines transportation infrastructure. How do you increase the volume of cars that can move through a given artery? Taking that mindset and instead transitioning towards how do you expand the number of jobs and services within a 30-minute commuter shed for your typical constituent? And those are two totally different ways of thinking about the world. And this bill, to me, is really a bridge. It really goes from the former mindset to the latter one, where we're now measuring and coaxing states and cities to measure how much thicker is the labor market, how many more amenities can you access based on the transportation investments that you're making. Again, that's good for economic development. That's good for public health. It also is tremendously good for the environment. And then there's the models that we can use. And I've been talking about this from long before I got to Congress. What's frustrating sometimes about transportation policy is that we actually know what works. This is not an unsolved problem. You look at cities like Copenhagen, for example, in Denmark. They have knit together their inner urban core with their suburbs in a way that really makes it unnecessary for families to own cars because the transit, the cycling, the walking is so convenient, so reliable, so safe, and so comfortable that people are willing to use it. What people really want is access to mobility, not ownership of a single modality for mobility. And that is going to be a generational transition, not going to happen overnight, but this bill lays the framework for it.
Have you been able to begin to make inroads with some of your Republican colleagues on how they think about both climate and infrastructure? Because I've heard some, they like to keep them in separate pools. Others will say privately they understand they need to come together to make a cleaner, better country. But I'm interested in whether the tribalism in the Congress is keeping you from having those conversations behind the scenes, or whether you're beginning to sort of see, wow, there are some people that, we can make some common ground with from your perspective on these topics.
It's certainly making it harder. There is a generational dimension here. I do find that millennial Republicans are much more receptive to the idea of climate change as an existential threat and also new ways of approaching infrastructure. And I've been able to have some productive conversations on that front. I would say, though, that within the Democratic caucus, and certainly this is how I feel, I'm not really waiting another decade for Republicans to decide that, yeah, maybe we should group together climate change with infrastructure. You can get on board or you can not, but we're going to do it because it is urgent and it's necessary, and we've got to make these investments now.
Is there anything else Pete Buttigieg and President Biden should be doing in transportation that you have not yet seen them do? What would be the net add from Jake Auchincloss to the Biden plan?
I think continuing to give a lot of latitude to states and cities to make their own investments in mobility. We've seen that mayors have really, I think, been on the front lines of thinking about mobility in the most practical and effective way in the last 10 years. They've really driven the conversation. I'd like to see us continue to give mayors a lot of latitude to make those investments. I think being very receptive to public-private partnerships. I'll give you an example. There's a company called Via that works with cities for on-demand transit. So they basically look at the kind of the bus routes that the city has, the rail routes, and they say, with our shared buses that people can call via phone or app, we can plug in some key gaps that you've got there. And they work with the local agencies. The current federal architecture for funding that is really challenging. My office has been working very hard to make it much easier for states and cities to work with innovative private sector partners like that. And I'd like to see us continue to do that.
Well, look, we're going to have you back and spend more time another day. You know, Jake Auchincloss, a representative from Massachusetts, is vice chair of the Financial Services Committee. He's a member of the Transportation Infrastructure. We've been talking about both sides of this, both the financial sector and how it's going to give, a premium to investment in these areas, make it sustainable, get value creation in this sector. But what we need to also do by way of, probably the largest infrastructure investment in this nation that we're going to have in a generation. So, Jake Auchincloss, thank you so much. Congratulations on joining us here in Washington, and really appreciate your candid thoughts.
Thanks for having me on.